Our first paper is by Dr. Jake Nabel. He is the Tombros Early Career Professor of Classical Studies and an Assistant Professor of Classics and Ancient Mediterranean Studies at Pennsylvania State University. He is a historian of ancient Rome, pre-Islamic Iran, and the points of contact between the two. Professor Nabel's research interests include Roman-Parthian relations, the reception of Alexander the Great in Persian literature, early imperial Latin poetry, and late antique Armenia. He is currently writing his first book on a group of Arsacenid princes who lived at the court of the Roman emperor in the 1st century CE. So today he'll be giving a talk on fake bowing from the Achaemenids to the Sasanians. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Kate, for that kind introduction. I also want to thank Robert Rollinger and our very gracious host, Rahim Shayagan, for inviting me to participate in the inaugural event of this workshop series. Achaemenid studies could not be in the hands of more distinguished scholars or more generous ones. And finally, much gratitude to Marissa Stevens and Lexi Henning for everything they've done to bring us together today. My topic today is Greeks and Persians and pretending to bow. And this relief is my point of departure. The visual program at Persepolis makes it very clear that bowing and court ceremonials were of enormous importance for the Achaemenids. Out of all the ways that a king could be depicted, out of all the activities that a king might be shown doing, this relief shows the king receiving a gesture of deference and greeting from a subject. And it puts us, the viewers of the relief, in the audience of the bowing ritual. Now, it's a matter of debate exactly which gestures people of various social ranks had to perform before the Achaemenid king, and I'm not out to resolve that debate today. But I do have a contribution to make to the study of how Persian bowing was remembered in the Greco-Roman Mediterranean, where it was called proskunesis, usually translated obeisance or adoration. My point of entry to this issue is a passage in the historian Procopius, who wrote in Greek and lived in the Eastern Roman Empire in the 6th century CE. The Greeks and Romans told themselves that proskunesis was a mark of Eastern despotism, something unworthy and inappropriate for free people like themselves. But a passage from Procopius unsettles that self-assured narrative. And the topic of that passage is fake bowing. It's about an attempt to subvert the bowing ritual. That subversion in Procopius runs very deep, and it ultimately undermines the Greek world's triumphalist narrative about its independence from Persian imperial authority. In Procopius, the fake bower in question is the Sasanian king Peroz. The year is 484 CE, and Peroz has to contend with an invasion of the Hephthalite Huns in the Sasanian East in the region of Bactria, shown in the circle on the map here. Peroz marches into a trap, and his army is totally surrounded by the Hephthalites. The Hephthalite king Achaemenid says to Peroz, "I won't kill you. You and the Persians can leave with your lives if you swear oaths to me, pledge that you will never attack my kingdom again, and," here is the kicker, "if you bow down before me in full view of both of our armies." At this, Peroz grows very desperate, and he turns to the Magi, the Zoroastrian priests in his camp, for advice. And as Procopius tells the story, here's what the Magi say to Peroz. Quote, "The Magi replied that he, Peroz, should manage the matter of the oath as he saw fit, But as for the rest, he should circumvent his enemy through cleverness. They had a custom of prostrating themselves before the rising sun each day. Peroz should pay close attention to the time of day and meet with the Hephthalite leader at dawn and make obeisance having turned towards the rising sun. In this way, he could escape the subsequent dishonor of the deed. And if you'll permit me to illustrate this with a sophisticated diagram. In other words, the Magi are saying, we can use our religion to play a trick on Ahshunvar. We will make him think that you're bowing down to him, but in fact, you'll just be bowing to the sun, just as we always do as a regular part of our morning prayers. And in Procopius, this works, at least in his telling. The ceremony is performed, the Persians are released by the Hephthalites, and the passage ends with Peroz marching away in good spirits. It's a good story, but it's not Procopius' story, at least not entirely. Procopius is clearly and obviously reworking another tale about Persians and fake bowing, but this one is set in the Achaemenid period, almost 1,000 years before Procopius' time. The Persian king in this instance is Artaxerxes II, and the fake bower is Ismenias, an important politician in the Greek city of Thebes, which is indicated under the blue arrow here. Ismenias and other Thebans were part of an embassy to the Persian court, which was probably at Susa at the time, under the red arrow on the map. This takes place in 367 BCE. We have two Greek accounts of Ismenias' audience with Artaxerxes. Neither one is contemporaneous. They're both composed under Roman rule hundreds of years after the fact. Here are those two accounts side by side. I'll first read the account of Plutarch, who's on the left side of the slide. He's a biographer writing in the late 1st or early 2nd century CE. As he tells it, quote, Ismenias the Theban and Pelopidas also approached the king, Artaxerxes. Pelopidas, for his part, did nothing shameful. But when Ismenias was ordered to make obeisance, he threw down his signet ring on the ground in front of him. He then bent over and picked it up, creating the appearance of making obeisance. On the right-hand side of the slide, we have Aelian, who's writing about another 100 years after Plutarch. In his version, quote, I would not wish to conceal a deed of Ismenias the Theban that was at once clever and Hellenic. When he approached and came into the presence of the king, he removed the signet ring he happened to be wearing and surreptitiously tossed it at his feet. He quickly bent over as if he were making obeisance and picked it up again. He created the appearance of bowing to the Persian, but he did nothing to incur shame among the Greeks. Now, I'm not the first person to notice the parallel between this vignette and the Peroz narrative in Procopius. Geoffrey Greatrex and Henning Böhm have both pointed it out, though they only cite Plutarch and not Aelian, and that actually matters, as I'll discuss shortly. But more importantly, is one thing to notice the parallel and another thing to actually explain it, and that's what I'll try to do right now. What is Procopius' relationship to this much older story about Ismenias? Why evoke the memory of Ismenias in a story about Persian campaigns in Central Asia? And what is the reader supposed to make of the relationship between the two tales? The essential background here is that Procopius was completely steeped in classical Greek historiography on the Achaemenid Empire, the influence of which is all over the wars. For instance, Anthony Caldelis and Connor Whately have both recently discussed how Peroz's campaign against the Hephthalites in Central Asia is quite clearly modeled on the Achaemenid king Darius's campaign against the Scythians, at least in Herodotus's telling. In both cases, you had a Persian empire dealing with the sort of slippery and wily enemy from the Central Asian steppe, at least from the Greek point of view. So Procopius clearly knew Herodotus's histories quite well, and he borrowed from that text in productive and generative ways. He was very well versed in Greco-Persian interaction during the Achaemenid period. For a historian with such pronounced classicizing tendencies, he would not have missed the opportunity to put the case of Peroz in dialogue with the case of Ismenias. To understand better the nature of that dialogue, let's look a bit more closely at a couple key phrases from our two sources for the fake bow of Ismenias. One feature of this tradition that Procopius taps into, I think, is brought out by the highlighted phrases here, and that is, the Ismenias story could be remembered in different ways by different commentators who could see different implications in the story for Greek reputation and honor in Ismenias' deception. This is why it's important to survey not just Plutarch, but also Aelian. The Ismenias tradition is not unitary. It's a contested subject in the sources. If we turn first to Plutarch on the left, you can see the operative phrase is Pelopidas, for his part, did nothing shameful. Pelopidas was another Theban who went on the embassy to Artaxerxes, and Plutarch hastens to tell us that he did nothing shameful. He did not bow down before the king. There is a clear contrast here, which Plutarch draws with the help of a men de construction in the Greek. On the one hand, on the other hand. On the one hand, Pelopidas did not act in a disgraceful fashion, which implies that Ismenias did act in a shameful fashion. The point of the ring trick was to escape the disgrace of formal prostration before the Persian king, but Plutarch doesn't seem to think that it actually served that objective at all. Ismenias' ruse was a foolish and desperate attempt, in his view, to salvage his dignity from a fundamentally undignified act. Plutarch tells us the story, but he rejects its underlying logic. Aelian, by contrast, on the right side of the slide, he seems to buy into the story. Unlike Plutarch, he does think that Ismenias escaped disgrace through the ploy of the ring. You can see that in his final sentence, he did nothing to incur shame among the Greeks. But the first sentence, which is highlighted here, goes even further than that. Ismenias' conduct was not just clever, sophos, it was also Hellenic, Hellenikos. There was something characteristically Greek about the way that Ismenias wriggled out of the Persian prostration ritual. This is a sort of Hellenic thing to do because the Greeks see this as a degrading and debasing and ultimately humiliating mark of Eastern despotism. So you have to get out of this ritual by any means necessary. Ismenias manages to do this right under the nose of the Persian king himself. Aelian clearly finds this subversive act to be totally delightful. He thinks that Ismenias really pulled this off. So what are the implications of this bifurcated tradition for Procopius' take on Peroz? Potentially, I think, something quite unsettling for Procopius' readers, or at least those readers who espoused the Greek triumphalist memory of Greco-Persian engagement during the Achaemenid period. The first implication is that the reader should read against the grain and regard Peroz's tactic with skepticism. Procopius' text presents the king's son prostration as a kind of clever stratagem that rescued the king from disgrace, but by invoking the conflicted literary tradition that surrounded Ismenias, Procopius reminds the reader wait a minute. There are some people who see ruses like this as desperate and pathetic gimmicks, as the last resort of cornered people who are desperate to salvage some shred of dignity from an inescapably humiliating situation. If you think Peroz was clever, well, then what about Ismenias? Moreover, there's another element that might cause the reader to think twice. Aelian's assessment was that Ismenias escaped disgrace not only by being clever, but by being Hellenic, by being characteristically Greek in his evasion of a Persian custom. But now the very same ruse, the ruse of the fake bow, is deployed in a sense by the very same person it was supposedly used on in the first place, namely the Persian king. If the Persian king is the deceiver in one story, does it really make sense to see him as the deceived in the other? Not only are Persians acting like Greeks, which might be discomfiting enough, but the parallel suggests that the Persians could have been wise to the trick the entire time. In the face of that realization, any power that the Ismenias tradition might once have had to assuage Greek humiliation at the feet of Persian supremacy, that power totally evaporates. The story loses its ability to convince Greeks of their own cleverness and to preserve their dignity as they are at the feet of the Persian king. There's one final intertext with the stories of Ismenias and Peroz that I think drives this point home even more. This story comes from Jewish literature, and its appearance there underlines that the fake bowing motif was not confined to Greek historiography. This kind of story circulated across political and linguistic and cultural frontiers in the ancient Mediterranean and the Near East. It gave diverse readers a way to think about dignity and how to maintain their dignity in a world where there were lots of kings demanding that their subjects bow down. So here are the basics of the Jewish story, which I've learned about mostly from an excellent piece by Shay Cohen. A mother and her 7 sons are taken prisoner by a tyrannical king. And they're ordered to either eat pork, in some versions of the story, or to bow down before an idol in other versions of the story. In either case, obviously un-Jewish activities. They all refuse to perform this activity, and so the sons are executed one by one until only the 7th son is left. And the 7th son is always tempted in some particular way. He's offered some kind of enticement or some special sort of deal. But the 7th son always inevitably says no to the king as well, and so the 7th son is also executed in the end. The story appears first in the 2nd and 4th books of Maccabees, where the evil king in question is the Seleucid king Antiochus IV. But there are lots of versions of this story in lots of texts. And the one that I'm quoting from here is from the Babylonian Talmud, or the Bavli. This is one of several versions of the story where the 7th son is offered a particular kind of deal by the king. Let me read the passage and explain what that deal is. So the passage runs, "It was the youngest brother, the 7th brother, who had said this, and the emperor," literally the Caesar in the Aramaic, "pitied him. Seeking a way to spare the boy's life, the emperor said to him," and now imagine the emperor's taking the 7th son aside and having a private word with him, not in hearing of the rest of the court. He says to him, "I will throw down my signet ring before you. Bend over and pick it up, so that the people will say, 'He has accepted the king's authority.' The boy said to him, 'Woe to you, Caesar, woe to you, Caesar, if you think,'" and he goes on in this vein for quite some time, but suffice it to say, his answer to this bargain is, "No, I'm not taking the deal. You'll get no further with me than you did with my brothers. No dice." And he is executed as a result. So what does this passage show? At a minimum, it shows that the seven brothers' story could be detached from the historical setting of the Maccabean revolt and applied to other sorts of imperial situations where Jews were persecuted by the authorities. This is a sort of plug-and-play kind of scene. But for our purposes, more importantly, here we see the ring motif, the fake bowing motif, appended to the tale as a sort of special temptation for the seventh brother. Cut a deal with the imperial power and save your life. The ruse of the ring, the ruse of the fake bow, offers the young Jewish boy a way to do this. However, a major element has changed here. And to my mind, the variation throws a very different light on the cases of Ismenias and Peroz. In the Bavli, the ring ruse is not secretly deployed by the person who has to bow. Instead, it's suggested by the ruler who is demanding the bow. The ruler understands that his prisoner finds it morally unpalatable to bow down, and he doesn't want the prisoner to have to die, but at the same time, he regards the bowing ceremony as indispensable to the maintenance of his imperial authority. People have to see the bow take place. Even if the ruler and the prisoner have their own sort of secret understanding of what the bow actually means. The imperial power is willing to meet the imperial subject halfway. The subject can use whatever mental gymnastics he likes in order to make the act of the bow palatable to him, and the ruler might even help him perform some of those gymnastics. But the crowd of onlookers has to see the appropriate choreography. If the bower refuses to go through the motions, then he has to die. And that's the way that this story ends. So what does the Talmudic episode imply for the stories of Ismenias and Peroz? I hasten to say that I'm not positing a direct connection between Procopius and the Babylonian Talmud, but then again, I don't think I really need to. I'm not sure whether Procopius knew of this tradition through Jewish literature. It's quite a better prospect, actually, that he knew of it through Christian literature, because the Maccabean martyrs end up being quite a popular topic in Christian historiography. But in any event, it's not necessary to pin down the direct path of transmission. The appearance of the ring motif, of the fake bowing motif in late antique Jewish texts, shows that it circulated freely and widely across cultures and linguistic groups in both Roman and Persian territories. It was around, it was in the air, so to speak. Procopius's familiarity with variations of this sort, i.e. that the ruse of the ring is suggested by the king rather than by the person who has to bow before the king. We can't prove that he knew these kinds of variations, but it would make sense for an author who was very well versed in a variety of historical traditions, as Procopius undoubtedly was. So what ultimately is the takeaway of the Bavli passage for Procopius? I think it offers an additional suggestion that Peroz might not have deceived or hoodwinked the Hephthalite king, just as Ismenias might not have deceived Artaxerxes. The king who demands the bow can be in on the ploy that protects the bower from dishonor. The king can negotiate and facilitate the conditions that allow his subjects to bow with a clean conscience. The king cares about what the audience sees. He doesn't necessarily care about what bowers have in their hearts. The king would say, tell yourselves whatever sort of self-serving fiction you need, so long as it gets you on your knees in front of me. I'm not interested in conquering your mind, but your body has to kneel. I don't claim, of course, that Artaxerxes or Ahshunvar must have had conversations like those with Ismenias or Peroz. But I do think that the story of Peruz's bow in Procopius dredges up a number of intertextual connections that make the reader question how fake bowing actually works. The connection to the Ismenias story is really crucial, since the core function of that story, as we see in Aelian's version, was to preserve Greek dignity in the face of bowing before the Achaemenids and the necessity to do it. But Procopius problematizes that narrative. He's adversarial to classical Greek triumphalism. He's not simply a reproducer of it. To conclude, let me return very briefly to the Persepolis relief that I started with. Ismenias and Peruz offer a quite forceful reminder that we don't always know or understand the elaborate, negotiated, and sometimes secretive arrangements that brought bowers before the Achaemenid king like this. The Procopius passage isn't direct evidence for any such arrangements, but through its web of intertextual associations, the passage pulls back the curtain on the intrigue, the deception, the self-deception, and the accommodation that lay behind the choreography of power. Behind the scenes, Achaemenid kings and their subjects contrived and connived to stage the ceremony of empire for the benefit of the imperial audience. When we look at the Persepolis reliefs, we are members of that audience, and we see what the Achaemenid kings wanted us to see. But Ismenias and Peruz ask us to think about what was going on backstage. Thank you.